In 1984, a woman sitting in a concrete room in Novosibirsk told her psychiatrist that a reactor would melt. She said it calmly, the way you might describe what you had for breakfast. She named the city. She described the graphite. She talked about the taste of metal in the air and the children who would lose their hair in clumps weeks later. She described a plume of smoke that would poison the land for 1,000 years. And then she moved on to the next thing, as if she were reading from a list she had memorized a long time ago. The psychiatrist, apparently, wrote it down. He also pressed record. That was 1984. Chernobyl happened in 1986. The recording surfaced 38 years later on a board where people share stories about things that shouldn't exist. And for the past 2 years, nobody, not linguists, not audio engineers, not historians, not hoax hunters, has been able to fully explain them. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've spent the last 11 weeks going through everything, every thread, every analysis, every attempted debunking, every rabbit hole that opened beneath my feet when I thought I'd finally found solid ground. What I'm going to share with you tonight is everything I've found. And I need to be honest with you from the beginning. I started this investigation certain I would find the seam, the stitch, the moment where the hoax reveals itself. Every good mystery has one if you look hard enough. I was looking for that moment. I haven't found it. Let me take you back to where this begins. Not 1984. Not Novosibirsk. It begins, like so many modern mysteries, on 4chan. On March 14, 2022, an anonymous user on the board, that's the board dedicated to the paranormal and unexplained, created a thread with a simple subject line. Translated from the original Russian post, it read, "I found these in my grandfather's things. He worked at Facility 6. I don't know what to do with them." Attached were 2 audio files. Low bitrate. Heavy static. The sound quality was, frankly, terrible, the kind of muddy, distorted audio you'd expect from a reel-to-reel tape recorder that had been sitting in a box for nearly 4 decades. Most people scrolled past. A few clicked. And a few of those people spoke Russian. Within hours, the thread had exploded. The audio contained a conversation between 2 people, a man and a woman. The man spoke in the measured, detached cadence of a Soviet-era clinician. He used specific terminology, phrases like pathological fantazirovanie, which translates roughly to pathological fantasizing, a diagnostic category used in Soviet psychiatry in the 1970s and 80s but largely abandoned after the fall of the USSR. He referenced medication protocols that matched what we know about the pharmaceutical practices in Soviet psychiatric institutions during that period. The woman, identified in the recordings only as Lena, spoke quietly but clearly. She did not sound distressed. She did not sound delusional. She sounded, according to the dozens of Russian speakers who would eventually weigh in, like someone who was very tired and had given up trying to convince anyone that what she was saying was true. In that first recording, Lena described what she called the fire that poisons. She described a city near a river where people would be told to evacuate but too late. She described a number, 4, which she said was the reactor. She described the month. April. She described the year. 1986, she described a helicopter dropping sand and boron onto a burning core, and she described how the pilots would die. The thread was archived. Copies were made. And over the next 6 weeks, the anonymous poster uploaded 12 more recordings. 14 in total. Each one between 9 and 23 minutes long. Each one appearing to be a separate therapy session. Each one containing Lena's calm, methodical descriptions of events that, in 1984, had not yet occurred. Let me walk you through the 5 predictions in the Lena transcripts that no one has been able to adequately explain. The first is Chernobyl. I've already described this, but I want to emphasize the specificity. Lena did not simply predict a nuclear disaster. She described reactor number 4. She described the city of Pripyat and its evacuation. She described the liquidators, a term that would not enter common usage until after the disaster. She described acute radiation syndrome in language that, while not medically precise, was startlingly accurate for someone who supposedly had no scientific training. She described the red forest, the area surrounding the reactor where pine trees turned a rust color and died from radiation absorption. That term, red forest, did not exist until 1986. In 1984, those trees were alive and green. But Lena used the phrase. She said, the forest turns red and they bury the trees. The second prediction is the Armenian earthquake of 1988. In recording 7, Lena describes what she calls, the city that collapses in the mountains of the south. She gives a death toll, she says, 25,000, maybe more. The actual death toll of the Spitak earthquake was estimated between 25 and 50,000. She describes buildings, folded like paper, and specifically mentions that the construction was poor, that the buildings were not built to withstand what hit them. This was, in fact, one of the major findings of the post-disaster investigation, that shoddy Soviet-era construction dramatically increased the death toll. Lena mentions this 2 years before an earthquake that no seismological model predicted at that magnitude. The third prediction is the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. In recording 9, which appears to have been recorded during a session in late 1984 based on contextual references, Lena tells the psychiatrist, calmly, almost apologetically, that the country will not exist by the end of 1991. The psychiatrist's response is audible on the tape. He pauses. Then he asks her to repeat what she said. She does. She says that a man with a mark on his head will begin changes that cannot be stopped, and that by December, the flag will come down. She uses the word December specifically. The Soviet Union formally dissolved on December 26, 1991. The reference to a man with a mark on his head has been widely interpreted as a description of Mikhail Gorbachev and his distinctive birthmark, though Lena never uses his name. In 1984, Gorbachev had not yet become General Secretary. He assumed the position in March of 1985, months after this recording was allegedly made. The fourth prediction concerns the August 1991 coup attempt. In the same recording where she discusses the fall of the USSR, Lena describes what she calls, the 3 days when the old men try to take it back. She describes tanks in a city, she doesn't name Moscow specifically, but she describes a white building that people will stand around to protect. The Russian White House, the seat of the Russian parliament, was the focal point of civilian resistance during the August coup. It is, notably, a white building. Lena says the coup will fail and that the man on the tank will become the new leader. Boris Yeltsin famously stood on a tank outside the White House on August 19, 1991, in what became one of the most iconic images in Russian political history. He subsequently became the first president of the Russian Federation. This event was 7 years in the future when Lena allegedly described it. The fifth prediction, and the one that has generated the most debate, concerns the Kursk submarine disaster. In recording 13, the second to last recording, Lena's tone shifts. For the first time in the transcripts, she sounds genuinely distressed. She describes the men under the water who knock on the walls. She says they are in a vessel, that something has exploded inside it, that the vessel has fallen to the bottom. She says the number, 118. The Kursk submarine disaster of August 12, 2000, killed all 118 crew members. Lena says, they will knock for days and nobody comes. Post-disaster analysis confirmed that at least 23 crew members survived the initial explosions and retreated to a rear compartment, where they survived for hours, possibly days, while awaiting rescue that came too late. The sound of tapping was reportedly detected by rescue vessels. In 1984, the Kursk submarine had only been in service for a few years. Its destruction was 16 years in the future. 5 events. Decades apart. Different in nature, a nuclear disaster, an earthquake, a political dissolution, a coup, a submarine catastrophe. Yet Lena described all of them with details that were not available to anyone on Earth at the time these recordings were supposedly made. That alone would be enough to make this one of the most compelling mysteries I've ever encountered. But the details of the predictions are only the first layer. The second layer is the recordings themselves. When the Lena transcripts gained traction outside of 4chan, spreading to Reddit, to Russian-language forums, to YouTube, and eventually to the attention of people with actual expertise, the first and most obvious line of investigation was the audio itself. If these recordings were made in 2021 or 2022 and designed to sound old, there should be evidence of that. Modern audio forensics is sophisticated. We can detect the fingerprints of digital editing. We can identify the telltale compression artifacts of files that have been processed through modern software. We can analyze the spectral profile of a recording and determine, with reasonable confidence, what kind of equipment captured it. 3 separate analyses were conducted that I'm aware of. The first was informal, an audio engineer on Reddit who goes by a handle I'll decline to share, who analyzed the publicly available files and posted his findings. The second was conducted by a small group of researchers associated with a Russian university, though they've asked not to be named. The third was done by an independent audio forensics consultant in Germany who was contacted by a journalist investigating the story for a now-defunct online magazine. Their findings were consistent, and I want to be precise about what they said and what they didn't say. What they said: the spectral profile of the recordings is consistent with audio captured on a Soviet-manufactured reel-to-reel tape recorder, most likely an Electronica model from the early 1980s. The background noise profile, the hiss, the hum, the specific frequency of electrical interference, matches what you would expect from a recording made in a concrete institutional building with Soviet-era electrical infrastructure. The frequency roll-off at both the high and low ends is consistent with the microphone technology available in Soviet institutions during that period. The compression artifacts present in the digital files are consistent with audio that was digitized from a physical tape using consumer-grade equipment, likely a USB cassette converter, sometime in the 2010s or early 2020s. What they didn't say: none of the 3 analyses were willing to definitively state that the recordings could not have been faked. The Reddit engineer noted that a sufficiently skilled audio designer could theoretically replicate these characteristics, but added, and I'm quoting his post directly, "The level of knowledge required to fake this convincingly would be extraordinary. You would need access to period-accurate equipment, or you would need to model the complete signal chain of a 1983 Electronica recorder including the specific tape formulation used in Soviet institutional settings. I've worked in audio forensics for 12 years and I could not do this." The German consultant was more cautious. She said the audio was consistent with but not proof of a 1980s Soviet origin, and noted that absence of evidence of tampering is not the same as evidence of absence of tampering. Which is fair. That sounds scientific reasoning. But she also added, in a footnote that doesn't get cited as often as it should, that in her professional opinion, the recordings were among the most convincing period-accurate audio artifacts she had encountered in her career, and that faking them would require either original equipment or an almost absurdly detailed understanding of analog audio degradation. So, the audio appears to be real, or it was faked by someone with resources and knowledge that border on the implausible. But there's a third layer, and this is where I started losing sleep. The language. Russian is not a monolith. Like any language, it varies by region, by era, by social class, by institutional context. The Russian spoken in a Novosibirsk psychiatric facility in 1984 would sound different from the Russian spoken in Moscow in 2022 in dozens of subtle ways: vocabulary, cadence, the specific bureaucratic and medical jargon used, even the patterns of self-censorship that were endemic to Soviet public speech. You didn't say certain things, or you said them in certain ways, and those patterns are as distinctive as a fingerprint to someone who knows what to listen for. Multiple Russian linguists and native speakers who analyzed the transcripts noted the following. The psychiatrist uses terminology and diagnostic frameworks consistent with the Snezhnevsky school of Soviet psychiatry, which dominated institutional practice in the 1970s and 1980s. This included the controversial diagnosis of sluggish schizophrenia, a diagnosis widely criticized in the West as a tool for political repression but genuinely used by Soviet clinicians who operated within that framework. The psychiatrist in the recordings references this diagnostic category specifically when discussing Lena's case. He uses it naturally, not as if he's performing it for an audience, but as if it's simply the lens through which he sees his patient. Lena's speech patterns are consistent with a woman from Western Siberia, likely from a working-class or lower-middle-class background, with a secondary education but not a university degree. Her vocabulary is limited in certain domains, she struggles with technical terms and often describes things in analogies rather than precise language. But her syntax is clean, her thoughts are organized, and she displays none of the linguistic markers typically associated with schizophrenic speech disorder, no loose associations, no neologisms, no tangential or derailing thought patterns. Whatever was happening to Lena, she did not sound like a woman experiencing psychosis. Several native speakers noted something else, something harder to quantify but, in some ways, more significant. They noted that both speakers used what one commenter called the small language of the Soviet institution. The way the psychiatrist begins certain sentences. The way Lena occasionally self-corrects, catching herself before she says something that might be interpreted as politically sensitive. The ambient social choreography of a conversation between a patient and an authority figure in a system where the wrong word could extend your commitment indefinitely. Multiple people who grew up in the Soviet system said the recordings felt authentic in a way that would be extremely difficult to manufacture. One commenter, who identified themselves as a former Soviet psychiatrist now living in Israel, wrote, "Either this was recorded in a Soviet facility, or it was created by someone who spent years inside one. So now we have 3 layers. Predictions that came true. Audio that appears genuine. And language that experts say is either authentic or the product of an almost inconceivable level of research and craft. And then there is the 4th layer. Lena herself. Across 14 recordings spanning what appears to be several months of sessions, a portrait emerges of a woman who does not understand what is happening to her and is frightened by it. Not by the visions themselves, but by the fact that no one believes her and that her descriptions of future events are being used as evidence of her illness. In recording 4, she asks the psychiatrist, and this is one of the moments that stays with me, if I am making this up, then why can I not stop? She says she does not choose to see these things. They come to her, she says, like remembering something that hasn't happened yet. She compares it to the feeling of déjà vu, but reversed. She says it is as if she has already lived through these events and is now being forced to remember them from a point in time before they occurred. The psychiatrist's responses are clinical. He does not ridicule her. He does not express belief. He follows what appears to be a standard therapeutic protocol, reflecting her statements back to her, probing for internal consistency, noting contradictions. In recording 6, he asks her when these experiences began. She says she has had them since she was a child, but they became more intense and more specific after a period of illness. She describes a fever that lasted several days, during which she says, time came apart and she could no longer tell the difference between what had happened and what was going to happen. The psychiatrist notes this. He asks about the fever. She provides details. She was 16, she lived in a small town whose name is partially obscured by static but appears to end in Insk. She was treated at a local clinic. The psychiatrist asks if she was given any medications during this illness. She says she doesn't remember. He asks if she experienced any head injuries. She says no. He asks if anyone in her family has experienced similar phenomena. She pauses for a long time. Then she says her grandmother knew things, but she says it quietly, as if it's something she's not supposed to talk about. In recording 11, the dynamic shifts in a way that is, frankly, chilling. The psychiatrist's tone changes. He becomes more direct, less reflective. He asks Lena to describe events not in the future, but in the present. Specifically, he asks her to describe events happening in other locations at that moment. He asks her what the weather is like in Moscow. He asks her to describe what is on the desk in the facility director's office. He asks her a series of questions that sound less like therapy and more like a test. A controlled experiment. As if someone has instructed him to evaluate her claims more rigorously. Lena's responses to these questions are uncertain. She says she can't do it like that, it doesn't work that way. She becomes agitated, one of the few times in the recordings where she sounds genuinely upset. She says, "I don't see sideways. I only see forward." The psychiatrist asks what she means by forward. She says, "In time. I only see forward in time." He asks her how far forward she can see. She goes quiet. Then she says, "I see the end." He asks her what she means. She says, "The end of things. The end of the country. The end of the name." He asks her to be more specific. She says she can't. She says it's too big. She says trying to describe it is like trying to describe the shape of a room when you're standing inside it. That is the last thing Lena says in recording 11. The audio continues for another 40 seconds, you can hear the scratch of a pen, the creak of a chair, the distant sound of what might be a door closing somewhere in the building. Then the recording ends. Recording 12 contains something that no one has been able to explain satisfactorily, and it's the detail that pushed this investigation from compelling hoax territory into something I genuinely do not know how to categorize. In this session, the psychiatrist asks Lena to describe, in as much detail as possible, the submarine event she had mentioned in a previous session. Lena provides additional details. She describes the location, the Northern Sea, where the fleet goes. The Kursk was stationed with the Northern Fleet in the Barents Sea. She describes the cause, a weapon inside the vessel that breaks apart. The Kursk disaster was caused by the detonation of a practice torpedo. She describes the response, they refuse help from the outside. After the disaster, the Russian government initially refused international assistance, a decision that was widely condemned and that may have cost survivors their lives. And then she says something that the psychiatrist clearly does not understand, because he asks her to repeat it. She says, "There is a second sound. After the first breaking, there is a second, larger one. The second one is what kills the vessel. The time between is 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The official investigation into the Kursk disaster, concluded in 2002, determined that the initial explosion of the torpedo was followed by a second, catastrophic detonation approximately 2 minutes later when the fire reached additional torpedo warheads. The exact interval between explosions was recorded by seismological stations in Norway and has been estimated at approximately 2 minutes and 15 seconds. In 1984, the torpedoes that would destroy the Kursk had not yet been manufactured. The submarine itself was still in active service, years from its final deployment. The seismological data that would pinpoint the interval between explosions would not exist for 16 years. And Lena said 2 minutes and 15 seconds. I need to stop here and address the obvious question, because I know you're thinking it, and I was thinking it too. This is a hoax. It has to be. Someone created these recordings using period-accurate equipment, researched the linguistic and medical details, and reverse-engineered the predictions from publicly available information about events that had already occurred by 2022. It's elaborate. It's impressive. But it's a hoax. And you might be right. In fact, statistically, you're almost certainly right. The prior probability of genuine precognition is, by any rational measure, essentially zero. The history of paranormal claims is a history of hoaxes, misattributions, cold reading, and confirmation bias. I know this. I am, by disposition and training, a skeptic. But let me share with you the 4 reasons I cannot comfortably close the book on this case. First, the anonymous poster who uploaded the recordings has never been identified. Despite significant effort by multiple online communities, no one has been able to trace the account, identify the individual, or find any prior work by whoever created these recordings. If this is a hoax, it is an anonymous one. The creator has sought no credit, no attention, no monetization. The original post was made from a VPN. The files contain no identifying metadata. The poster made exactly 16 comments in the original thread, answered a handful of questions in broken English, and was never heard from again. In the world of elaborate internet hoaxes, this is unusual. Most hoaxers eventually reveal themselves, or are revealed. Most hoaxes have a purpose, to promote something, to demonstrate something, to gain notoriety. The Lena transcripts have no apparent purpose. They appeared, and the person who posted them vanished. Second. Facility 6. Several researchers attempted to verify the existence of the psychiatric facility referenced in the recordings. Soviet-era psychiatric institutions were numerous, and many operated under number designations rather than names. Records from the Soviet period are incomplete, particularly for institutions that may have been involved in politically sensitive work. However, in 2023, a researcher working with declassified Soviet Health Ministry documents found a reference to a Facility 6 in the Novosibirsk Oblast, associated with a psychiatric research program that operated between 1979 and 1988. The documents do not describe the nature of the research. The facility appears to have been closed and its records transferred to an archive that was partially destroyed in a fire in 1993. This proves nothing. It also proves that the person who created the hoax, if it is a hoax, either got very lucky, or had access to Soviet archival materials that are not publicly available. Third. The 14th recording. I've saved this for now because it requires context that I hope I've built sufficiently. The 14th and final recording is different from the others. It is shorter, only 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The audio quality is worse, as if the recording equipment was malfunctioning or the tape had degraded more severely than the others. The psychiatrist is not present, or at least he does not speak. What you hear is Lena, alone, speaking quietly. She is not addressing anyone. She appears to be talking to herself, or possibly to someone she believes is listening but who we cannot hear. She says she knows this is the last recording. She does not explain how she knows this. She says that she has tried to tell them everything she can, but there are things she cannot describe because the language doesn't exist yet. She says something that has been translated in several different ways, but the most common translation is, "The words I need won't be invented for 20 years." And then she says something that turned this from a story into an obsession for me. She says, "If someone hears this later, if someone finds the tapes, I need them to understand that I am not sick. I see what is coming. I have always seen what is coming. And what is coming after the submarine, after the drowning men, is worse. What comes in the new century is the unraveling. It starts with a city of towers. It starts with fire in the sky on a clear morning." The most natural interpretation of this passage, a city of towers, fire in the sky on a clear morning, is September 11, 2001. The World Trade Center. A clear September morning. This detail was not present in any of the earlier recordings. It appears only in this final, fragmentary tape, spoken by a woman alone in a room in a facility that may or may not have existed, in a country that would not exist 7 years later. And then she says one more thing. She says, "After the towers, there is a sickness. It goes everywhere. The whole world closes its doors. And then static. And then nothing. The whole world closes its doors." COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic in March 2020. Global lockdowns followed. The whole world, in a very real and literal sense, closed its doors. Now, let me tell you why this should make you more skeptical, not less. The 14th recording is, by far, the most dramatic and the most emotionally compelling piece of the puzzle. It is also, by definition, the most suspicious. If you were designing a hoax, this is exactly how you would design it. You would build slowly, establishing credibility with verifiable predictions of moderate specificity, and then you would end with a devastating emotional climax that connects the mystery to events your audience personally remembers. The 14th recording is almost too perfect. It hits every note. It references 9/11, which is the defining trauma of the American audience that would eventually consume this content. It references COVID, which is the defining shared experience of the generation that would encounter these tapes on 4chan and Reddit. It is structured like a narrative climax, not like a therapy session. And the fact that Lena is alone, that the psychiatrist is absent, conveniently eliminates the need to write convincing dialogue for a second character while also creating a sense of intimacy and urgency that makes the content more emotionally affecting. I say this not because I've made up my mind, but because I want you to understand that I see the architecture of potential manipulation here. I am not blind to it. But I keep coming back to the interval between the explosions. 2 minutes and 15 seconds. That number is not in any popularized account of the Kursk disaster that existed before the transcripts surfaced. It's in the technical reports. It's in the seismological data. It's the kind of detail that a hoaxer could find, yes, but it's not the kind of detail a hoaxer would think to include. It's too specific and too obscure to serve the purpose of a hoax, which is to be convincing to a general audience. A general audience doesn't know the interval between the explosions on the Kursk. A general audience doesn't even know there were 2 explosions. This detail serves no narrative purpose. It's not dramatic. It's not emotionally resonant. It's just precise. And its precision is what makes it so difficult to dismiss. I keep coming back to the language. To the Soviet psychiatrist who uses Snezhnevsky's diagnostic framework not as a performance but as a reflex. To the way Lena self-censors without being aware she's doing it. To the ambient texture of institutional power that pervades every second of those recordings. You can research that. You can study it. But can you inhabit it so completely that native speakers who lived through the Soviet system cannot tell the difference? I keep coming back to the audio. To the spectral fingerprint of a machine that hasn't been manufactured in 40 years. To the specific frequency of electrical hum that matches the power infrastructure of Soviet institutional buildings. To the particular pattern of tape degradation that is consistent with magnetic tape stored in suboptimal conditions for decades. You can simulate that, perhaps. But 3 separate analysts said they couldn't find the seam. And I keep coming back to the silence. To the fact that whoever made this, whether they were a hoaxer or a relative of a dead psychiatrist cleaning out a storage unit, has never come forward. Has never claimed credit. Has never posted again. Has never tried to leverage this into anything. The tapes appeared, like something surfacing from deep water, and the hand that released them withdrew and has not been seen since. There is a 5th reason, and I debated whether to include it because it ventures into territory I can't verify and I want to be responsible about what I present. But I think you deserve to hear it. In late 2023, roughly 20 months after the transcripts surfaced, a user on a Russian-language forum dedicated to Soviet history posted a photograph. The photograph appeared to show a patient file from a psychiatric institution. The file was heavily redacted, but the visible portions included a patient identifier, a first name and a patronymic. The first name was Elena. The patronymic was partially obscured but appeared to begin with VL-. The file referenced a facility in the Novosibirsk Oblast. The admission date was consistent with the timeframe of the recordings. And in the section for diagnostic notes, partially visible beneath the redaction, was a phrase that several Russian speakers translated as persistent prophetic ideation. The photograph was removed from the forum within hours. The user's account was deleted. No cached version has been found. The only evidence that it existed at all is screenshots taken by 3 different users before it disappeared, and those screenshots are, themselves, impossible to fully authenticate. If the photograph was real, it suggests that somewhere in a Soviet archive, possibly damaged, possibly incomplete, possibly in a box that has not been opened since the 1990s, there is a file for a woman named Elena who was committed to a psychiatric facility near Novosibirsk for the crime of knowing what was going to happen next. If the photograph was fake, it was the second layer of an extraordinarily sophisticated and purposeless hoax, a hoax that someone has invested years of effort into, for no apparent reward. Here is what I think, for whatever my opinion is worth. I think the Lena transcripts sit in a category that is genuinely rare in the landscape of internet mysteries. They are not obviously fake. They are not obviously real. They resist classification in a way that is, itself, deeply unsettling. The evidence does not point clearly in either direction, and every attempt to resolve the ambiguity opens a new question. If they are real, they represent something that our current understanding of reality does not accommodate, a human being who experienced time in a way that is fundamentally different from how the rest of us experience it, and who was punished for it by a system that had a diagnosis for every deviation from the approved version of reality. If they are a hoax, they represent something almost equally remarkable, a work of art so meticulously crafted and so perfectly calibrated that it has withstood 2 years of scrutiny from linguists, audio engineers, historians, and the collective investigative obsession of the internet, and it has done so while its creator remains invisible. Either way, something extraordinary happened. Either a woman in 1984 described the future with impossible accuracy, or someone in 2022 created a forgery of such depth and precision that it functionally cannot be distinguished from the real thing. I don't know which possibility disturbs me more. The recordings are still out there, if you know where to look. Copies live on archive servers and in shared drives and on hard drives belonging to people who downloaded them before the original thread was archived. They've been translated, transcribed, analyzed, spectrographed, and debated in dozens of languages. And the conversation always ends the same way, with a silence that nobody can fill. Because here's the thing about the Lena transcripts that keeps me awake. If Lena was real, if she genuinely experienced what she described, then she spent her life in a concrete room, watched over by people who believed her mind was broken, trying to warn a world that couldn't hear her about disasters that would kill thousands. And she knew, with the same certainty that she knew about the reactor and the submarine and the towers, that no one would listen. That the tapes would sit in a box for decades. That by the time anyone heard her voice, everything she tried to prevent would have already happened. And if recording 14 is genuine, if the final thing she saw was real, then she saw more than she described. She said, what comes after the towers is worse. She said, it starts with the unraveling. She described the pandemic. She described the doors closing. But then the tape runs out. The static takes over. And we don't hear what came next. She saw further. She saw things she didn't have time to say, or things she chose not to say, or things for which, as she put it, the words had not yet been invented. And we are living in the time she was looking at. In the dead air at the end of recording 14, in those last seconds before the static swallows everything, if you listen carefully, and many people have, with headphones, with audio enhancement software, with the desperate focus of someone searching for a message they're not sure they want to find, you can hear something. It might be breathing. It might be a word, half-formed and then abandoned. It might be nothing at all. Just the sound of old tape running past a dead microphone in an empty room. Or it might be a woman in 1984, alone in a facility that no longer exists, in a country that no longer exists, trying to tell us something we are not yet ready to hear. The tapes surfaced. The source vanished. The predictions came true. And the final recording ends in the middle of a sentence that we cannot complete. What do you think really happened? Was Lena a prophet, a patient, or a fiction? Is this the most elaborate hoax in internet history, or is it something else entirely, something that doesn't fit neatly into any category we've built? Leave your theory below. I've shared everything I've found. Now I want to hear what you see. Because Lena said she could only see forward. And forward is where we're all headed, whether we know what's coming or not.